In a research study of the National Catholic Office of the Deaf in the United States, there was a research study in a group of almost 100 Catholic deaf adults. It was found that many interviewees had difficulty making connections between their own life experiences and Christian tradition, because they stated that for deaf people, a Christian tradition was so full of a hearing worldview that it simply could not be for them the basis of a personal faith or view on life. And Hannah Lewis states that traditional Christian theology had constructed a view on deaf people as naturally immoral. Deaf people were described as impulsive and egocentric, and so deafness and disability in many outdated Christian theologies is a consequence of sin. So, and often the words of the Apostle Paul, faith comes by hearing, were taken literally. And in his book, I See a Voice, written by the deaf author Jonathan Rhee, Rhee describes that Western culture tends to overrate the human voice and hearing, and he indicates that phenomenon as phonocentrism. And I think that phonocentrism has very deep roots in Western religious tradition, and sometimes it seems that it touches the core of a Jewish Christian religious tradition that attributes metaphysical power to words and voice and speech, and that tends to depreciate visual representation. Let's say in the Bible it is said that God cannot be seen, but in many places concepts are used as the voice of God and so on. So with its healing stories in the Bible and its image of deafness as unwillingness to listen, the remnants of outdated theologies that link disability to a need of salvation, and its depreciation of visual sense, a Christian tradition is inaccessible for deaf people who meet in the deaf community a worldview that is able to explain their experiences and tells them that they are okay. That worldview of the deaf community, that's often very secular, does not feel any need of metaphysics, and often that substitutes a religion for many deaf people who grew up in a religious environment. The fact is that a Christian tradition was transmitted to deaf people by hearing pastors that were also involved in education in institutions for the deaf. In the era of oralism, these persons saw deafness as a defect and education of the deaf as a work of charity. And these hearing people often were not conscious of the hearing context of their message and their faith and their tradition. And often they confused that hearing context with the essence of the message. And I have to admit that I lived in such an institute for the deaf in St. Michielsgestel, where that tradition was very strong in the past. So those persons did not dialogue with deaf people about the typically hearing aspects of their message and the differences with the deaf world view. I think that model that was used implicitly in pastoral ministry in the past had striking similarities with the way in which Christian missionaries brought the Christian message to Latin America. From the 16th century on, at the era of conquista, the Spanish word for conquest. A Christian message was confounded with the Spanish culture. So becoming a Christian meant also talking Spanish, behaving like a Spaniard, eating Spanish food, and so on. So by consequence, the rich local cultures were oppressed, and they continued to survive only below the surface. So, let's say, in the same way, pastoral ministry with the deaf can be described often as spiritual colonialization. And in her PhD work, Hannah Lewis compares this colonialism also with experience, for example, of the people of the African country of Burundi, when it was taken over by the Belgians. The Burundian society was seen as medieval and primitive. Burundians were seen as children in need of guidance, and the schools started to teach French instead of the own language of Burundi.